The year 1909 saw the Women's Social and Political Union, under the leadership of Emmeline Pankhurst, at the height of its popularity. For the Liberal government, the women's movement had become a real problem, particularly their alarming new tactic of hunger strikes and public disruption, which the government could no longer ignore. Its response to the challenge was openly hostile, and it sanctioned the brutal force-feeding of the hunger strikers, a policy which brought great embarrassment when it became public knowledge. Although the government could not control the steady flow of pro-suffrage merchandise which had appeared, it could nullify the effect of supportive plays and literature. It therefore took the decision to ban any such work.
Oh, it's only you.
Another one, sir. She's chained herself.
Chained herself? How? To what? We've taken away the railings and everything that a chain can be passed through.
We forgot the foot scrapers, sir. She lay down on the flags and got the chain through before she started hollering. She's out there now. She says you've got the key to the padlock in a letter in a buff envelope and that you'll see her when you've opened it.
She's mad. Have the scraper dug up and let her go home with it hanging round her neck.
There is a buff envelope. There, sir.
You're all afraid of these women. You must seem to have a key in it. Dear Midge. Well, I'm dashed.
Yes, sir.
What do you mean by yes, sir?
Well, you said you was dashed, and you did look, if you'll excuse me saying it. Well, you looked it.
This is a letter from the Prime Minister, asking me to release the woman with this key if she padlocks herself. And to have her shown up and to see her at once.
Don't do it, Governor.
How often have I told you not to address me as Governor? Remember that you are a soldier, not a vulgar civilian. And remember also that when a man enters the army, he leaves fear far behind him. Here's the key. Unlock her and show her up.
Hey, unlock her? Oh, it doesn't. Lord knows what she'd do to me.
Obey your orders, sir. Instantly. Do not presume to argue. Even if she kills you, it is your duty to die for your country. Right turn. Quick march.
Votes for women! Votes for women! Votes for women!
Votes for women, votes for women, votes for women! Votes for children, votes for babies, votes for monkeys!
In you go. In person, sir.
Stop! Madam, what are you doing? You must not undress in front of me! No, even your letter from the Prime Minister will not...
Dear Mitchell, I am the Prime Minister.
Good heavens! Balsquith!
Yes, it is indeed Belsquith. It has come to this. The only way in which the Prime Minister of England can travel from Downing Street to the War Office is by assuming this disguise, shrieking votes for women and chaining himself to your door scraper. Well, then at the corner in force, they cheered me. Bella Christina herself was there. She shook my hand and told me to say that I was a vegetarian, because the diet in Holloway is better for vegetarians.
Bernard Shaw wrote this satire in 1909 to reflect the grip which the suffragette movement had on popular imagination. The subject was so sensitive that the targets of this brief sketch, Henry Asquith, the Prime Minister, Herbert Gladstone, the Home Secretary, and the Minister for War, Lord Kitchener, banned its performance. The issue of giving votes to women was first raised by John Stuart Mill in the 1870s. His theme was not taken up until early this century, when a Manchester woman, Emmeline Pankhurst, began working as Registrar of Births and Deaths. What she witnessed appalled her.
It was touching to observe how glad the women were to have a woman registrar to go to. They used to tell me all their stories. Dreadful stories, some of them. And all of them pathetic with that patient and uncomplaining pathos of poverty. I was shocked to be reminded over and over again of the little respect there was in the world for women and children. If civilization is to advance at all in the future, it must be through the help of women. Women freed of their political shackles, women with full power to work their will in society. I asked myself many times in those days what was to be done. I had joined the Labour Party, thinking that through their councils something vital may come, some such demand for the women's enfranchisements that the politicians could not possibly ignore. Nothing came.
On the 10th of October 1903, Mrs. Pankhurst, her daughters Sylvia and Christabel, and other northern women of similar opinions, took matters into their own hands. They founded the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. Under the motto, "Deeds, not words," their aim was to secure the votes for women. A ray of hope appeared. In the February of 1905, a sympathetic MP named Bamford Slack agreed to submit a private member's bill on the subject of female suffrage. The bill that occupied the first order on that day was one providing that carts travelling along public roads at night should carry a light behind as well as in front. Hostile MPs used this triviality to talk out the suffrage bill, which never had a hearing. The WSPU staged a protest outside the House of Commons. It was their first act of militancy.
Will the Liberal government give votes to women?
We were in the grip of policemen and surrounded by stewards. The matter must not, I knew, stay where it was. We must bring the matter into court, into prison. For simply disturbing the meeting, I should not be imprisoned. I must use the infallible means of getting arrested. I must assault the police. I couldn't strike them. My arms were being held. I couldn't even stamp on their toes. Yet I must bring myself under arrest. The vote depended on it. I could, even with all limbs helpless, commit a technical assault. And so I found myself arrested and charged with spitting at a policeman. It was not a real spit, but only, shall we call it, a pout, a perfectly dry purse of the mouth. At the police station they sent us home without bail, adjuring us to appear next morning at the police court. Next morning we found that the long newspaper silence as to women's suffrage was broken.
Being my first visit to jail, the newness of the life numbed me. I do remember the plank beds, the skilly, the prison clothes. I also remember going to church and sitting next to Christabel. She took my hand tenderly and just held it, as though I was a lost child being guided home. She understood my feelings of strangeness.
They decided that the next step must be to carry the fight to London, and Annie Kenny was chosen to be organiser there. With only £2 in her pocket, the intrepid girl set forth on her mission.
The meeting was attended by the very poorest women of Canning Town. I told them of all the wonderful things that would happen to them once women got the vote. Poverty would be practically swept away. Washing would be done by municipal machines. In fact, paradise would be there.
In 1906, Parliament reassembled under the Liberals. Members of the WSPU made repeated attempts to present a deputation to the Prime Minister, Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, but were continually rebuffed. Even with the backing of Keir Hardie, leader of the Labour Party, the women made little headway in their attempts to influence government. His resolution on women's suffrage met the following response. The Right Honourable William Randall Kramer MP warned that
if once they open the door, they enfranchise this very small group of females, it would be impossible to close it again. The government of the country would be taken over by a majority, not of men, but of women. Women are creatures of emotion and do not decide questions of fact as men do. I am too fond to drag them into the political arena and ask them to undertake obligations and duties which they do not understand. It is not only that I think women are unfitted to exercise political power by their natural presence, but because I believe that the majority of them do not want it.
Frustrated in their attempts to influence government, the WSPU called a meeting. Under the leadership of Mrs. Pankhurst, the Women's Parliament met at Caxton Hall to consider the King's speech and its notable omission of any reference to giving them the vote. The resolution passed by this meeting was to be carried to the House of Commons, but the deputation was charged by mounted police. 57 women and 2 men were arraigned and sent to prison. Undeterred, the WSPU designed a flag for itself. Purple to represent justice, white for purity, and green for hope. These colours were raised at more than 3,000 meetings nationwide between May and October 1907.
A by-election was held in the division of Mid-Devon, a stronghold of liberalism. The constituency is a large one, and the population of the towns is rough and boisterous. We held meetings twice a day, calling voters to beat the government in Mid-Devon as a message that women must have the vote next year. On the day of the election, it was announced that the Unionist candidate had won the seat. But we knew instantly that the deepest resentment of the Liberals would be aroused. We were warned that our safety demanded an immediate flight from the town. I laughingly assured our friends that I was never afraid to trust myself in a crowd, and we walked on. Suddenly, we were confronted by a crowd of young men and boys who wore the red rosettes of the Liberal Party, and they were mad with rage and humiliation. We were deluged with a shower of clay and rotten eggs. We were not especially frightened, but the eggs were unbearable, and to escape them we rushed into a village shop. The poor grocer cried out that his place would be wrecked, so I asked him to let us out the back door. The rowdies, anticipating our move, had surged round the corner and were waiting for us. The brave wife of the shopkeeper, hearing the shouts and oaths of the men, flung open the doors and rushed to our rescue. As I reached the threshold, a staggering blow fell on the back of my head. Rough hands grasped at the collar of my coat, and I was flung violently to the ground. A long time seemed to pass while the ring of the men slowly grew closer. One of the youths darted towards me, but at that very moment came a shout and a rush of police who had fought their way through hostile crowds to rescue us. It was many months before I recovered from my injuries.
On January the 17th, 1908, Miss New and Nurse Olive Smith chained themselves to the railings outside number 10, creating a disturbance which enabled their colleague Flora Drummond to gain entrance to the building itself. She was ejected, and all three of them were arrested.
When the Third Women's Parliament met in Caxton Hall, it did so with all the splendid courage and enthusiasm for militant action that had characterised its predecessors. It was now known that an excellent place in the private members' ballot had been won, and on the Women's Bill, by Mr. Stanger, a Liberal. It was realised that strong pressure must be brought to bear upon the government to prevent the bill from being wrecked. The whole hall seemed to rock with the noise of cheers as the majority of the women present sprung up to form a deputation. Large crowds had gathered to see them, whilst the police were drawn up on either side of the road. The constables pushed and jostled the women, but at Broad Sanctuary, a large contingent of policemen blocked the way. Undaunted, the women pressed forward. The police charged again and again, and there was grave danger that someone would be trampled underfoot. When at last the streets were cleared, it was found that 50 women had been arrested.
When the cases were tried, Mr. Musket, who prosecuted for the Crown, told the women that they would be subject to the usual maximum of 2 months' imprisonment. He said, "It was proposed to revive, for the benefit of the suffragettes, an act passed in the reign of Charles II, which provided that no person should dare to go to the King or the Parliament with any petition, complaint, remonstrance, declaration, or other address, accompanied by a number of persons above 12. A fine of £100 or 3 months' imprisonment might be imposed under this law." The next day's session of the Women's Parliament was one of intense excitement, as the women reviewed the events of the previous day, the trials, and especially the threat to revive the obsolete Act of Charles II, as an act which was passed to obstruct the Liberal Party, which came into existence under the Stuarts. It was an amazing thing that the political descendants of these men were proposing to revive the act to obstruct the advance of the women's cause.
At last it was realised that women are fighting for freedom as their fathers fought. If they want 12 women, aye, and more than 12, if 100 women are wanted to be tried under the Act and sent to prison for 3 months, they can be found.
In March 1908, suffragette activism lost the Liberals their seat at the Peckham by-election. Campbell Bannerman resigned his office because of ill health, and Mr. Asquith took over as Prime Minister. 60 Liberal MPs asked Asquith to enact the Women's Suffrage Bill within the lifetime of the Parliament, to which the new Prime Minister replied that it was wholly out of the question. Mrs. Pankhurst organised a mass demonstration to protest at his response.
When I mounted my platform in Hyde Park and surveyed the mighty throngs that waited there, and the endless crowds that were still pouring into the park from all directions, I was filled with amazement, not unmixed with awe. We felt that we had answered the challenge in Mr. Gladstone's declaration that the power belongs to the masses, and that through this power the government could be influenced. So it was with real hope that we dispatched a copy of our resolution to the Prime Minister, asking him what answer the government would make to that unparalleled gathering of men and women. Mr. Asquith replied formally that he had nothing to add to his previous statement, that the government intended at some indefinite time to bring in a general reform bill which might be amended to include women's suffrage. A wonderful demonstration had made no impression whatever upon him. We had to choose between two alternatives. We had exhausted argument. Either we had to give up our agitation altogether, or else we must act. And go on acting until the selfishness and the obstinacy of the government was broken down, or the government themselves destroyed.
At noon on October the 12th, Emmeline, Christabel and Flora Drummond were each served with an imposing legal document which read,
"Information has been laid this day by the Commissioner of Police that you, in the month of October, in the year 1908, were guilty of conduct likely to provoke a breach of the peace by initiating and causing to be initiated, by publishing and causing to be published, a certain handbill, calling upon and inciting the public to do a certain wrongful and illegal act, viz., to rush the House of Commons."
After an elaborate game of hide-and-seek, the three women were arrested the following evening. Bail was denied them, and they spent the night in police cells.
Mother at once claimed the right as an untried prisoner to communicate with the outside world and dispatched telegrams to several MPs. A weary hour or two went by. Then the door of her cell was thrown open and Mr. Murray, a Liberal Member of Parliament for East Aberdeenshire, appeared. He was horrified to find three ladies in these surroundings, and promising to return soon, he hurried to the Savoy Hotel, and they arranged for various comforts to be sent to the prison. The bare little place with its dingy wall was wonderfully transformed. Numbers of tall wax candles were lighted. The tables were laid with silver, flowers and brightly coloured fruit, and three waiters were ready to serve the prisoners with an elaborate meal. At the same time, Mr. Murray supervised the carrying into the cells of three comfortable beds. The management of the Savoy had thrown themselves into the enterprise with the greatest eagerness, and having acted throughout with most overwhelming kindness, ending by refusing to charge anything at all.
At the trial, the case for the accused was carried out by one of the defendants, Christabel Pankhurst, who held a degree in law. After her summing up, Mrs. Pankhurst herself made an impassioned plea from the dock.
We have tried to be womanly. We have tried to use feminine influence. And we have seen that it is of no use. Men who have been impatient have invariably got reforms through being impatient. We are here today because we realise the condition of our sex is so deplorable that it is our duty to break the law, to call attention to the reasons we do so. Now, we have tried every way. We have presented larger petitions than were ever presented for any other reform. We have succeeded in holding greater public meetings. We have faced hostile mobs at street corners because we were told we could not have that representation for our taxes which men have won, unless we converted the whole of the country to our side. We have been misrepresented. We have been ridiculed. We have had contempt poured upon us. We know we need the protection of the vote even more than men have needed it. We are not here because we are lawbreakers. We are here in our efforts to become lawmakers.
She and Mrs. Drummond were sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment, and Christabel to 10 weeks. On reaching Holloway, Mrs. Pankhurst demanded the rights accorded to political prisoners, which were denied her. In protest, she broke the regulations by deliberately speaking to her daughter during exercise, for which she was characterised a dangerous criminal and placed in solitary confinement. The public outcry was such that the Home Office sent orders that Emmeline and Christabel were to be allowed to talk and exercise together for 1 hour each day, and that they were to be granted the privilege of access to newspapers. It is the right of subjects to petition the King, and all commitments and prosecutions for such petitionings are illegal.
I wrote these words from the Bill of Rights on a parliamentary wall because I thought they were in danger of being forgotten by our legislators, and because I intended that they should be indelible.
She was sent to prison for 1 month, into the 3rd Division for common criminals rather than the 1st, which was designated for political offenders. When the Home Secretary refused her application to be placed in the 1st Division, she went on hunger strike. After 91 hours without food, she was released from prison in a state of collapse. From this moment on, the hunger strike became the central thrust of the suffragette strategy. Mary Lee was sentenced to imprisonment for throwing a roofing slate at the car of the Prime Minister. After 48 hours in which she refused all food, the prison doctor was sent for. He warned her that her actions were futile, and on no condition would she be released on medical grounds. He would take whatever steps necessary to force her to eat.
The wardresses forced me onto a bed. While I was held down, a nasal tube was inserted. It is 2 yards long, with a funnel at the end. The end is put up the right and the left nostril on alternative days. Great pain is experienced during the process, both mental and physical. The drums of the ears seem to be bursting, and there is a horrible pain in the throat and breast. The tube is pushed down 20 inches. The doctor stands up on a chair holding the funnel at arm's length and pours the liquid down, about a pint of milk and egg. If the doctor does not think that the liquid is going down sufficiently swiftly, he pinches my nose with the tube in it and my throat, causing me increased pain.
Upon hearing that these methods were being adopted in his prisons, Edward VII wrote to the Home Secretary.
Dear Mr. Gladstone, the King is very glad to learn that more stringent and precautionary measures are to be taken with regard to the suffragettes, whose behaviour of late has, in many cases, been a public scandal.
The King did not long outlive his discreditable endorsement of such brutality. His death early in 1910, coupled with a general election, which returned to power a parliament hung between the Liberals and Conservatives, created a new mood of placation between the suffragettes and the government. Mrs. Pankhurst declared a truce, and MPs from all parties formed the Conciliation Committee for Women's Suffrage. Under their auspices, a conciliation bill was introduced before the House by D.J. Shackleton. At its second reading, it was passed by a majority of 109, bigger than given to the budget. The government then exercised its right of veto. There followed a violent demonstration on what became known as Black Friday. The Vice President of the Royal College of Surgeons was so shocked by what he witnessed that he felt compelled to write to the newspapers.
The women were treated with the greatest brutality. They were pushed about in all directions and thrown down by the police. Their arms were twisted until they were almost broken. Their thumbs were forcibly bent back, and they were tortured in other unnameless ways that make one feel sick at the sight. These things were done by the police. As this behavior is entirely a new departure, it would be interesting to know who issued the instructions that they were to act with such brutality.
I cannot start the new year without putting my name down for the next protest against the policy of the government. I fully realise that the only way for us to get the vote is to fight for it. Please enter my name for the next protest. I should like to help to hasten the day when we shall have votes for women. Messages such as these came thick and fast to the WSPU offices as 1912 began. A grave incitement to that within days he allowed these special privileges to Mrs. Pankhurst and the other ladies. When these ladies discovered that the granting of First Division status was not universal, they went on hunger strike.
I flung open the door of my cell. On the threshold I saw doctors, and at the back of them a large group of wardresses. I caught up a heavy earthenware water jug from the table hard by, and with hands that now felt no weakness, I swung the jug high. "If any of you take one step inside my cell, I shall defend myself," I cried. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Then the doctor confusedly muttered something and they all retreated. The wholesale hunger strike created a tremendous stir throughout England. And every day in the House, ministers were harassed with questions. Shocked to the depth of his soul by the insults thrown at our women, Mr. Lansbury confronted the Prime Minister.
You are beneath contempt, you and your colleagues. You call yourselves gentlemen, and you forcibly feed and murder women in this fashion. You ought to be driven out of office. Talk about protesting. It is the most disgraceful thing that ever happened in the history of England. You will go down to history as the men who tortured innocent women.
Militancy was now delivered by a cabinet minister. He declared that in the case of votes for women, there had not been the kind of popular uprising which accounted for the burning of Nottingham Castle in 1832 or the tearing up of the Hyde Park railings in 1867. In fact, there had been no evolution of popular feeling. This sensational challenge to women by a minister for the Crown had a decisive effect on the future course of the women's suffrage movement. By holding up to us the example of men's method of winning the vote, he was taking the very grave responsibility of inciting us.
Look at this. The West End of London last night was the scene of unexampled outrage on the part of the militant suffragists. Bands of women paraded Regent Street, Piccadilly, the Strand, Oxford Street and Bond Street, smashing windows with stones and hammers. In all quarters the outrage, carefully planned and executed, occurred with startling suddenness, and shopkeepers found their property damaged and destroyed before any steps could be taken to prevent the onslaught. By 7 o'clock, practically the whole of the West End of London was a city of broken glass. In all, about 120 women, including Mrs. Pankhurst, were arrested.
The women were convicted and sentenced to 9 months' imprisonment. So much pressure was brought to bear upon the Home Secretary because they were not accorded political status.
There followed destructive militancy on a hitherto unparalleled scale. Petty injuries continuing side by side with large-scale damage. Street lamps were broken. Votes for Women was painted on the seats at Hampstead Heath. Keyholes were stopped up with lead pellets. House numbers were painted out. Cushions of railway carriages slashed. Golf greens all over the country scraped and burnt with acid. A bowling green was cut in Glasgow. A mother and daughter, bearing an ancient name, spent much of their time travelling in trains in order to drop pebbles between the sashes of carriage windows, hoping the glass would smash on being raised. Old ladies applied for gun licences to terrify the authorities. Bogus messages were sent, calling up the army reserves and territorials. Telegraph and telephone wires were severed using long-handled clippers. A large envelope containing red paper and snuff was sent to every cabinet minister. The press reported that they all fell victim to the ruse. Works of art and objects of exceptional value became the targets of determined militants. Empty houses and other unattended buildings were systematically sought out and set on fire. Bombs were placed near the Bank of England, at Oxted Station, and on the steps of a Dublin insurance office. Where a capture was effected, the punishment varied. Up to 9 months for window breaking, 18 months or 2 years for arson.
In the February of 1913, a number of MPs suggested the arrest of Mrs. Pankhurst for the guerrilla tactics of the movement as a whole. She was apprehended after an arson attack on Lloyd George's uninhabited and half-built house at Walton Heath. The following April, she was tried at the Old Bailey for inciting to commit a felony and sentenced to 3 years penal servitude.
Years of imprisonment, with or without hunger strike. That was Mother's fate, and she knew it. Heroine. That is the name for her, and I say it though I am her daughter. How small we look in comparison.
From the moment I leave this court, I shall quite deliberately refuse to eat food. I shall come out of prison dead or alive at the earliest possible moment, and once out, as soon as I'm physically fit, I shall enter into this fight again. I'm not seeking, as it was said by the Home Secretary, to commit suicide. I want to see the women of this country enfranchised, and I want to live until that is done.
In response to Mrs. Pankhurst's declaration, the government passed the Cat and Mouse Act. As the law stood, if a person was discharged from prison on medical grounds, the period of sick leave was deducted from her sentence. The new act made it possible to discharge a prisoner, then readmit her once she was better, to resume her sentence as if nothing had happened.
Emily Wilding Davidson was a BA of Oxford University. She'd taken first-class honours in English. Yet the women's cause made such an appeal to her reason and her sympathies that she put aside every intellectual and social appeal and devoted herself to the work of the Union. She'd suffered many imprisonments and had been forcibly fed and most brutally treated. On one occasion, when she had barricaded her cell against the prison doctors, a hose pipe was turned on her from the window. She was drenched and all but drowned in icy water. Miss Davison, after this experience, expressed the deep conviction that now the conscience of the people would awaken only to sacrifice of a human life.
She stood alone there, close to the white painted rails where the course bends round at Tatnam Corner. She looked absorbed and yet far away from everybody else, and seemed to have no interest in what was going on around her. A minute before the race started, she raised a paper of her own, or some kind of card before her eyes. I was watching her hand. It did not shake. Even when I heard the sound of the horse's hooves pounding closer, I saw she was still smiling. And suddenly she slipped under the rail and ran out into the middle of the racecourse. It was all over so quickly. Emmeline was under the hooves of one of the horses and seemed to be hurled for some distance across the grass. The horse stumbled sideways and the jockey was thrown from its back. She lay very still.
Mrs. Pankhurst was out of prison on medical grounds as the funeral of Emily Davison approached. Without consultation, she extended her license in order to be able to attend. She was, of course, arrested, and for the first time went on both hunger and thirst strike. Mary Richardson was provoked to take action.
Law and its application reflected public opinion. Values were stressed from the financial point of view, not the human. I felt I must make my protest from the financial point of view, therefore, as well as letting it be seen as a symbolic act. I had to draw the parallel between the public's indifference to Mrs. Pankhurst's slow destruction and the destruction of some financially valuable object. A painting came to mind. Yes. The Venus Veloque had painted, hanging in the National Gallery. It was highly prized for its worth in cash. If I could damage it, I reasoned I could draw my parallel. I went out and spent my last shilling on an axe. I mentioned that these were my last shillings to show that I, like other militants, lived on our own small incomes and were not able to draw on large sums of money for my headquarters. I dashed up to the painting. My first blow with the axe merely broke the protective glass. The sound of the glass breaking attracted the attention of the attendant at the door, who in his frantic efforts to reach me slipped on the highly polished floor and fell face downwards. And so I was given time to get in 4 further blows with my axe before I was in turn attacked. 2 Baedeker guidebooks, truly aimed by a German tourist, came cracking against the back of my neck. A detective sprung on me and grabbed the axe from my hand. Angry people seemed to appear all around me. I was dragged this way and that. Once again I was taken back to Holloway. This time I knew there would be a long term of forcible feeding to face. I was in comparatively good health. I had but 2 wishes, 2 hopes. One, that Mrs. Pankhurst might benefit from my protest, and the other, that my heart would give out quickly. It is strange to think that it is our hearts that brought us into this movement, and that only its weakness could give us back our freedom.
The coming of the war in 1914 had a profound effect on the suffragettes. On the one hand, the movement was undermined, as a schism opened between the pacifists who followed Sylvia Pankhurst into a socialist grouping based in the East End, and the patriots who remained loyal to Mrs. Pankhurst and her other daughter Christabel. However, the war strengthened the cause by providing women with the opportunity to prove that when it came to serving their country, they were equal to men. In France, they were found not just nursing, but driving field ambulances. At home, they stoked factory furnaces, worked in boatyards, operated steamrollers, and most famously made munitions to supply the army. In 1916, it was perceived as necessary by the government to make alterations to the law and order that men serving at the front, and therefore away from home, should be able to register their votes. The contribution that women were making to the war effort could not be overlooked. Therefore, a conference on electoral reform was set up to examine all aspects of the franchise. In January 1917, this conference recommended that unmarried women on the local government register and the wives of men on the register should be allowed to vote, once they had reached the age of 30. The age limitation was included to prevent the creation of a female majority. Mr. Asquith stated in the House that
some years ago, I ventured to use the expression, let the women work out their own salvation. They have worked it out during the war. How could we have carried on the war without them? Short of actually bearing arms in the field, there is hardly a service which has contributed or is contributing to the maintenance of our cause in which women have not been at least as active and as efficient as men. I, for my part, feel it is impossible, consistently either with justice or expediency, to withhold from women the power and right of making their voice directly heard.
At a stroke, after a 50-year struggle, over 8 million women were enfranchised. The Great War, which had claimed so many lives, was to rage on for another 10 months. But at home, the battle for votes for women was well and truly won.